Hey people, I'm not even sure how to start this, but I guess the best place is the beginning. My name's Mike, I'm 34, and I'm from Delaware. I've been married to my wife, Jessica, for 6 years now. We met back in 2014 at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by a mutual friend. From the moment I saw her, I was hooked. She was funny, outgoing, and had this electric energy that lit up the whole backyard. At the time, I was working as a software developer at a small firm in Wilmington, and Jess was finishing her nursing degree. She told me she wanted to make a difference in people's lives, and I admired her for that. I was the shy, introverted guy who typically stayed in the corner nursing a drink, but something about her drew me out of my shell. That night, we ended up talking for hours about life, family, career dreams, and even goofy stuff like our favorite 90s TV shows. After that night, we started seeing each other regularly, and everything just seemed to fall into place. She felt like the perfect match for me, like the woman I had always been looking for. By 2017, we tied the knot in a small, intimate ceremony on the Delaware beaches, surrounded by family and close friends. Life felt perfect, or at least I thought it did. Fast forward to now, I work remotely in tech, and Jess has transitioned to a job as a medical billing specialist. About 3 years ago, we bought a small house in Newark, Delaware. We decided not to have kids, but we do have a dog, Max, who's been a steady source of comfort for me through all of this. I never thought I'd find myself writing a post like this, but here I am. What I once believed was a loving, solid marriage has slowly become something unrecognizable. It wasn't a sudden shift. It crept in gradually, like a fog I didn't notice until I was already surrounded. By the time I realized things weren't right, it felt like it was too late. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags, but when you're in love, you tend to overlook the cracks. For the first few years, Jess and I had a great relationship, at least on the surface. We spent our weekends exploring Delaware, going on hikes, or just binge watching shows. She was always the more social one, though, and loved hanging out with her friends. I didn't mind because I thought we trusted each other. The first signs that something was off started about 2 years ago. Jess began staying late at work more often. At first, she chalked it up to a heavy workload or helping out a friend. I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just stressed and trying to do her best. But then there were other things, the way she'd guard her phone like it held state secrets, or how she'd get weirdly defensive if I asked what she was up to. So I remember one night specifically, this was about 6 months ago. She got a text while we were sitting on the couch, and when I glanced at her phone, she snatched it up like I'd caught her doing something illegal. I asked her what that was about, and she laughed it off, saying it was work stuff and I shouldn't be so nosy. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go because I didn't want to seem paranoid. Then there were the lies. Small at first, like saying she went to lunch with a coworker when she actually went shopping, or that she was running errands when she was really hanging out with friends. They seemed harmless, but it was the way she doubled down on them, even when the truth wouldn't have been a big deal. It made me wonder what else she could be lying about. The intimacy started fading too. Jess was always too tired or too busy for sex, and while that happens in marriages, it felt like she was just shutting me out. I started questioning myself. Was I not doing enough? Was I working too much? But no matter how hard I tried to reconnect, it felt like I was chasing a ghost of the woman I married. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Jess had always been a bit dramatic and high maintenance, but I never doubted her love for me, or at least I didn't want to. Things came to a head one night when I tried to have a serious conversation about how distant she'd been. She flipped it back on me, saying I was being controlling and paranoid. I felt gaslit, but didn't have the evidence to push back. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the nightmare. Before I get into what happened next, there's someone you need to know about. My brother, Brian. Technically, he's my half brother. We share the same dad, but his mom passed away when he was a baby. My mom raised him like her own, and while I hate to sound bitter, Brian has always been the golden child. Growing up, my parents treated him like he could do no wrong, even when he was being an outright jerk. Brian has always been one of those people everyone seems drawn to. He's charming, good looking, and has this uncanny ability to make people like him, even when he doesn't deserve it. Meanwhile, I was the quiet, dependable one, the kid who got good grades, avoided trouble, and stayed in his lane. But none of that ever seemed to matter. Brian was always the favorite. Our relationship has always been complicated. Brian's one of those guys who can't seem to stay faithful or respect boundaries. When we were younger, he had this habit of flirting with my girlfriends, and yeah, two of them ended up sleeping with him. That was years ago, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't still sting. It felt like he got some kind of thrill out of taking what was mine, and I never understood why. Because of that history, I've always had this gnawing fear he'd try something with Jess. I even joked about it with her once, and she laughed it off, saying, "Ew, Mike, your brother? No way." She promised me there was nothing to worry about, and I wanted to believe her. I really did. Brian, on the other hand, didn't do much to ease my mind. He's the type of guy who assumes every woman is into him, and he'd always find an excuse to touch Jess. A hand on her shoulder, a hug that felt just a little too long. Jess would brush it off, rolling her eyes and saying, "That's just Brian being Brian." But it made my skin crawl. At family gatherings, he'd throw out comments like, "You're a lucky guy, Mike," or "Jess, if you ever get tired of him, you know where to find me." Everyone would laugh it off like it was harmless, but it grated on me. I didn't want to be that insecure husband, though, so I tried to let it go. Still, because of who Brian is and what he's done in the past, I could never shake this tiny voice in the back of my head. A part of me always wondered if he'd cross the line again, if he'd go too far, even with Jess. And as much as I didn't want to believe it, I was right. Growing up, it always felt like I was living in Brian's shadow. My parents adored him. He could show up late to dinner, skip chores, or blow off school events, and they'd just shrug it off like it was no big deal. Meanwhile, I had to fight for every scrap of their attention. If I brought home a B on a test, I'd get a lecture about not living up to my potential. Brian, he could fail a class and still get praised for trying his best. As we got older, the favoritism only became more blatant. My parents bent over backward to support him, no matter how many times he messed up. They paid his college tuition, even though he dropped out after 2 semesters, covered his rent, and even gave him money when he quit his job to figure things out. Meanwhile, I worked my butt off through school, held down a job, and never asked them for a single penny. The worst part was when they told me they wanted to buy him a house. A literal house. This was after I'd spent years saving up to buy my own home with Jess. I'll never forget the day they came to me and said, "Brian's had a tough time lately. Maybe we could all pitch in and help him get back on his feet." I was furious. I told them flat out that there was no way I was going to help Brian get a free ride while I was working hard to pay my own mortgage, because they acted like I was being selfish. Brian wasn't just my parents' favorite, he was their project. And every time I managed to build something for myself, he'd find a way to tear it down. When he slept with my ex-girlfriends, it wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the power he always seemed to have over me, the way he could swoop in and take what mattered to me without facing any consequences. No matter what I did, I was always stuck in second place. I spent years trying to separate myself from Brian and his chaos, but my parents wouldn't let me. They constantly reminded me that he's your brother and that I should look out for him. But no one ever asked who was looking out for me. When I married Jess, it felt like I'd finally built a life that was mine. I had a stable job, a loving wife, and a home I could call my own. For once, I felt like I was in control. But Brian has a way of invading everything, doesn't he? As much as I tried to push the thought away, I couldn't shake the fear that he'd find a way to ruin this too. He'd already proven time and time again that boundaries didn't mean anything to him, and my parents had never held him accountable. Deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to take what was mine. Again. And, just like I feared, that's exactly what he did. Before I dive into what happened, there's some context about my upbringing that's important. We grew up in a pretty religious household. Church every Sunday, prayer before every meal, the whole deal. My parents were big on family values. At least, that's what they preached. They used to say things like, "Family is everything," and "we're all in this together." But their actions didn't always line up with their words. Their version of family values revolved around Brian. It was like he was the sun, and the rest of us were just orbiting him. They gave him everything: attention, resources, and endless second chances. Me? I got lectures about being a good role model and reminders that I needed to set the example. Brian was the baby of the family, and my parents treated him like he walked on water. No matter how much he screwed up, they'd find a way to excuse it. He got caught shoplifting once when we were teenagers, and my mom's response was, "He's just trying to figure things out. Be patient with him." If I had done the same thing, forget it. They'd have grounded me for life and made me write an essay on why stealing is a sin. I spent my childhood watching them bend over backward to make his life easier. If he wanted something, they made it happen. He wanted a car at 16, they bought him one, a shiny used Mustang. I had to save up for years to buy my own beat up Civic. He wanted to quit his part time job because it was too stressful. They told him to focus on school and covered his expenses. Meanwhile, I was flipping burgers after school to afford my textbooks. When Brian got older, it only got worse. My parents offered to co-sign on his first apartment, then covered his rent when he couldn't keep a job. And as I mentioned before, they even floated the idea of buying him a house. A house. I couldn't believe it. They treated Brian like he was some fragile creature who needed constant care, while I was expected to carry the weight of the world, and honestly, it left me resentful. Not just of him, but of them too. When Jess and I got married, I hoped that chapter of my life was behind me. I thought I'd finally built something that Brian couldn't touch, something my parents couldn't meddle with. But deep down, I guess I always knew that wasn't true. It was only a matter of time before Brian found a way to blow up my life again. As much as I tried to move on and focus on my own life, Brian's presence was always looming in the background. My parents made sure of that. They'd constantly find ways to bring him up in conversations, reminding me that family sticks together and urging me to reach out to him more often. But I didn't want to. Brian had already crossed too many lines in the past, and I was tired of giving him chances. Still, my parents made me feel like I had some moral obligation to be his safety net. They'd say things like, "You're the older brother, Mike. It's your job to help him grow up." Never mind the fact that I was in my 30s, married, and working hard to build a stable life of my own, I was still somehow expected to babysit a grown man who refused to take responsibility for himself. Brian didn't make it any easier. He had this habit of showing up unannounced, usually when Jess and I were in the middle of something. He'd plop himself down on our couch, raid our fridge, and go on and on about his latest big plans. Plans that, unsurprisingly, never went anywhere. Jess used to think he was amusing, but even she started to get irritated with how often he would just drop by without warning. One day when we'd been dating a little over 6 months, Jess pulled into the driveway. What really got under my skin was how familiar he acted around Jess. I've mentioned before that Brian has always been flirtatious in this smug, overconfident way, but with Jess, it felt worse. He'd compliment her on her hair, laugh a little too hard at her jokes, and always find excuses to touch her. A hand on her shoulder, a lingering pat on her back. It made my blood boil. But when I brought it up to Jess, she'd just brush it off. "He's your brother, Mike. He's harmless." But I knew Brian. I knew how he operated. And I knew he wasn't harmless. Part of me wanted to believe Jess was right, that I was just being paranoid, that Brian was just being Brian, and that he wouldn't actually cross the line. But I couldn't ignore what I knew about him. The two girlfriends he'd slept with, the way he always seemed to get a kick out of undermining me, and the way my parents never, ever held him accountable. It felt like I was living next to a ticking time bomb. I just didn't know when it would go off. That moment finally came about a month ago. Jess had been working from home more often, and I'd started noticing little changes in her behavior. She began closing her office door during the day, something she'd never used to do. She'd get dressed up, even when she wasn't leaving the house. Then there were the phone calls. Short, whispered conversations that ended as soon as I walked into the room. One afternoon, I came home early after running some errands. As I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. Brian's car was parked out front. I stepped inside the house. It was quiet. Too quiet. Even Max, our dog, wasn't barking like he usually does when someone visits. I called out for Jess, but there was no response. Then I heard it. A laugh. Her laugh. Coming from upstairs. I froze. My mind raced, trying to convince me I was overreacting, that there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I was about to find. I walked up the stairs, each step heavier than the last, until I reached our bedroom door. It was cracked open just enough for me to see inside. And that's when I saw them. Jess, my wife, and Brian, my brother. Together, I didn't say a word. I just stood there, staring, as the life I'd worked so hard to build shattered in front of me. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. It could have been seconds or it could have been hours. It all blurred together. My brain was screaming at me to do something, say something, but I couldn't. I just stood there, staring at them. Jess saw me first. She gasped, her face going pale as she scrambled to cover herself with a blanket. Brian didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He just smirked like this was some kind of game to him. Mike, wait, I can explain, Jess stammered, sitting up and clutching the blanket around her. Explain? I finally managed to choke out. My voice was calm, too calm, like the eye of a hurricane. You're sleeping with my brother. What part of that needs explaining? Brian stretched lazily, completely unfazed. Relax, Mike. Don't make this a big deal. A big deal? I could feel the anger rising in my chest, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me explode. You're unbelievable. Jess started crying, babbling about how it was a mistake, how it didn't mean anything. I wasn't buying it. This wasn't some drunken one-night stand. This was calculated. You've been sneaking around behind my back, I said, my voice shaking. How long has this been going on? Jess didn't answer, but the way she avoided my gaze said it all. Brian, on the other hand, decided to pipe up. A couple of months, he said casually, like he was confessing to stealing the last slice of pizza. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. Get out, I said, my voice low but firm. Jess started to protest, but I cut her off. Both of you, get out of my house. Brian shrugged and started getting dressed, moving at his own leisurely pace. Jess begged me to let her stay, saying we could work through this, but I wasn't hearing any of it. When they finally left, I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even heartbroken. I was just exhausted. Exhausted by the lies, the betrayal, and the fact that Brian had done it again, taken something from me with no regard for the consequences. I knew I couldn't just let this slide. Not this time. Brian had walked all over me my entire life, and my parents had enabled him at every turn. This wasn't just about Jess. It was about years of resentment and anger finally boiling over. I wasn't sad. I was angry. And for the first time in my life, I decided I wasn't going to let Brian get away with it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with Max curled up at my feet, staring blankly ahead, replaying everything in my head like a never-ending loop. Jess's panicked face when she realized she was caught, Brian's infuriating smirk, the sound of their laughter echoing from upstairs before I opened the door. It was like my brain refused to let it go. What started as exhaustion quickly twisted into something sharper and angrier. This wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Brian had done it again. And Jess, the woman I'd thought I'd build a life with, she had thrown away everything we shared for him. Not some stranger, not even someone outside my family, but him. I could already hear the excuses my parents would make, brushing it off as they always did. So predictable. Victorian exile. Mike, he didn't mean it. You know how Brian is. The first thing I did was pack Jess's things. Clothes, shoes, toiletries, everything that was hers went into garbage bags. Each bag I tied felt like reclaiming a piece of my life she had trampled on. When I was done, I left them by the front door with a note taped to the top. You can pick these up when I'm not home. Don't contact me again. Then I turned my attention to Brian. Confronting him outright wasn't worth it. I knew how that would go. He'd just laugh it off like it was some joke, and my parents would rush to his defense as always. But I was done letting him walk away without accountability. I wanted them to see him for what he really was, and for once, I wanted them to feel the full weight of his actions. And that's when the plan came together. Was it petty? Absolutely. But after years of Brian's crap, I felt entitled to a little pettiness. Jess had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter in her rush to leave. I picked it up and scrolled through her messages, my stomach turning as I read her exchanges with Brian. It was all there. Flirty texts, disgusting inside jokes, and blatant dirty talk. I found their most recent exchange, composed a new message, and sent it. Come over to the house later. I'll be waiting in the living room. Lights off. Don't wear anything. X. Then, I deleted the message and placed the phone back exactly where I'd found it. The next step was simple. I called my parents. I invited them over for tea that evening, making sure to sound calm and normal. They didn't suspect a thing. By the time they arrived, I could barely contain myself. I ushered them into the kitchen, where I had set up tea and small talk, keeping them distracted while I waited for the inevitable. Sure enough, not long after they sat down, I heard the faint sound of the front door opening and footsteps heading into the dark living room. Brian had arrived. I gave it a moment, then casually led my parents into the living room, flipping on the light as I entered. And there he was. Brian. Butt naked, standing dead center in the room, looking like a deer caught in headlights. My parents gasped. My mom dropped her teacup, and the crash echoed through the stunned silence. For once, Brian didn't have a smug comment or an excuse ready. He just stood there, speechless, exposed in every sense of the word. It was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I ended up covering the next set. The moment the lights flicked on, it was like the entire room collectively forgot how to breathe. My parents stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief, staring at Brian in his naked, idiotic glory. It was better than I could have imagined. Brian, for once, didn't have his usual smug grin or a quick retort. He stammered, fumbling to cover himself with his hands, his face flushing redder than I'd ever seen. "What the hell is this?" my dad roared, his voice trembling with anger. My mom, meanwhile, looked like she might keel over on the spot. I crossed my arms and leaned casually against the doorframe, keeping my tone light but dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, I don't know, Dad. Why don't you ask him?" Brian stuttered, trying to string together a sentence, but before he could spit out one of his pathetic excuses, there was a creak from upstairs, the sound of Jess's office door opening. "Mike, what's going on down there?" Jess's voice called out, oblivious. Perfect. A few seconds later, Jess appeared at the top of the stairs, her laptop tucked under her arm. As she descended, her steps slowed until she stopped cold at the bottom, her eyes darting between Brian, my parents, and me. "Jess," my mom finally said, her voice shaky as she pieced it together. "What is this? What's going on?" The room fell silent as Jess's face drained of color. I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, you can't," I said, my tone icy and unwavering. "Go on, Jess. Why don't you tell them? Tell them how you've been sleeping with Brian. Tell them how long you've been sneaking around behind my back." Her mouth opened, then shut. Her eyes darted toward Brian, but he was no help, still fumbling to pull on his clothes and muttering, "This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I snapped, turning to my parents. "This is your golden boy. This is the son you've spent your entire lives defending and excusing. This is what he does. He destroys everything in his path, and then he expects the rest of us to clean up after him. This is what he does. He destroys everything in his path, and then he expects the rest of us to clean up after him." My dad looked ready to explode. His face red, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles turned white. My mom, on the other hand, looked utterly shattered, her hand trembling over her mouth as she stared at Brian like he was a stranger. "You slept with your brother's wife?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "How could you do something like this?" Brian finally managed to pull on his pants and find his voice, though it was the same cocky nonsense I'd heard my entire life. "Oh, come on, Mom, don't be so dramatic. It's not like they were happy anyway." That was the breaking point. My dad lunged forward, grabbing Brian by the arm and dragging him toward the front door with surprising force. "Get out," he barked, his voice loud enough to rattle the windows. "You're not welcome here anymore." "What? You're kicking me out?" Brian sputtered, his voice rising with disbelief as he struggled against my dad's grip. "Yes, I am," my dad thundered. "You've gone too far this time, Brian. I've spent my whole life making excuses for you, but I'm done. Get out." Now, Stop. I stood there, watching in stunned silence as my dad, the man who had coddled Brian his entire life, finally held him accountable. I couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, Jess tried to plead her case, tears streaming down her face. Mike, please, let me explain. I cut her off with a sharp wave of my hand. Don't bother, Jess. I'm done. You can pack your things tomorrow. I'll be filing for divorce. She broke down, sobbing, but I didn't care. I said her betrayal was beyond repair, and I wasn't about to let her tears manipulate me. Not this time. As my dad shoved Brian out the door, my mom turned to me, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mike, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with regret. I didn't know. I didn't see it. The house was eerily quiet after Brian and Jess left. My parents lingered awkwardly in the kitchen, unsure of what to say. My mom kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, mumbling apologies, while my dad sat in silence, staring at the table like the weight of Brian's actions had finally hit him full force. I can't believe you'd do this, my dad said at last. He looked older, worn down by the realization of what Brian had become. Believe it, I replied bluntly. This isn't new. He's been pulling crap like this his whole life. The only difference is this time it was my life he tried to destroy, and it's the last time. My mom shook her head, her face pale and drawn. Why would he? She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Because he can, I said, my voice cutting like a knife. You've let him get away with everything for as long as I can remember. Why wouldn't he think he could get away with this too? The words hung in the air like a slap. They didn't argue, didn't try to defend themselves. For once, they couldn't. After a few more minutes of strained silence, I told them I needed space and asked them to leave. My mom gave me a tearful hug on her way out, whispering, "We'll fix this, Mike. I promise." I didn't have the energy to respond. When the door closed behind them, I sat on the couch with Max, who curled up against me like he knew I needed him. The next morning, the anger that had been fueling me all day finally began to fade, replaced by a deep ache in my chest. The betrayal, the humiliation, it all hit at once, and it was overwhelming. But underneath the pain, there was something else. Relief. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from Jess's lies, free from Brian's shadow, free from the endless cycle of betrayal and forgiveness that had consumed so much of my life. It hurt, but it was a clean kind of hurt, like tearing off a bandage and letting the wound breathe. The next day, I started putting my life back together. I contacted a divorce lawyer to begin the process of cutting Jess out of my life for good. When she came by to collect her things, she cried and begged for another chance. Her tears didn't move me. You made your choice, Jess, I told her firmly. Now you have to live with it. She left, and as the door closed, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. As for Brian, my parents finally drew a line. They cut him off financially. No more rent money, no more enabling his destructive behavior. He ended up crashing on a friend's couch and picking up a part-time job at a gas station. I heard he's miserable, and honestly, I don't care. He created this mess, and now he has to live with it. The fallout has been a wake-up call for my parents, too. They've been trying to repair our relationship, apologizing for the years they spent enabling Brian and overlooking me. It's a start, but I'm not rushing to forgive them just yet. Actions speak louder than words, and for now, I need to focus on myself. Jess, from what I've heard, isn't handling the fallout well. She's living in a cheap apartment in Dover, waiting for the divorce to finalize. The landlord said, her life is falling apart, and I can't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She made her bed, just like Brian did. Now my house is quiet. Peaceful, even. I've been taking Max on long walks, throwing myself into work, and rediscovering who I am outside of the chaos. It's not easy, but it's better. Better than living with constant betrayal and anxiety. I've been through hell, but I've come out the other side stronger, wiser. In the weeks that followed, I kept my distance from everyone. Jess, Brian, and even my parents. I needed space to process everything, to let the pieces settle in my mind. I wasn't ready to forgive or forget. And honestly, I didn't want to. The anger I carried felt like fuel, a sharp edge driving me to rebuild my life on my terms. Then, one day, my mom called. Mike, she said, her voice softer than I was used to. Your dad and I have been talking. We'd like to come over for tea again, if that's okay, just to check in on you. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face them again. But there was something in her tone, an earnestness, maybe even regret, that made me agree. When the day came, I made sure everything was in order. The house was spotless, Max was calm, and I brewed a fresh pot of tea. My parents arrived right on time, carrying a box of cookies from a local bakery as a peace offering. We started with small talk about work, Max, and how I was doing. It was stiff, awkward, but not unbearable. I could see they were trying, and that mattered, even if I wasn't ready to let my guard down just yet. About halfway through the visit, I decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. So, I said, setting my mug down with deliberate calm, what are you going to do about Brian? My mom glanced at my dad before answering. We're not helping him anymore, Mike, she said, her tone firm. No more money, no more excuses. He needs to figure things out on his own. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. And you think that's enough? My dad sighed, running a hand through his hair. What do you want us to do, Mike? Disown him? I want you to hold him accountable, I said, my voice steady but unwavering. For once in his life, I want him to face the consequences of his actions. No more sweeping things under the rug. No more pretending everything's fine. They exchanged a look, and I could see they were grappling with it. But they nodded, and for the first time, I felt like they were actually hearing me. The conversation shifted after that. We dug into old wounds, unearthing years of grievances and unspoken pain. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't a magical fix, but it felt like a step forward. By the time they left, I felt lighter, like I'd finally let go of a burden I didn't realize I'd been carrying. But the highlight of the day came a few hours later, in the form of a text from a mutual friend, someone who'd always had my back. Dude, you're not going to believe this, the message read. Brian's working at the Shell station on Route 4. Saw him there today. He looks miserable. Now, I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't even about satisfaction. It was about justice. Brian was finally paying for the mess he'd made, and for once, I didn't have to do a thing to make it happen. That night, I sat on the couch with Max curled up beside me, sipping a beer and scrolling through old photos on my phone. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't sad, angry, or weighed down by the past. I just felt free. That said, thank you so much for watching. If you're still there, I really appreciate you for that. Please subscribe and check my other stories. See ya.